The orphanage sat on the edge of town, a weathered old building with paint peeling off its walls and windows that creaked in the wind. For Ella, it had been home for as long as she could remember, though the word home didn't quite fit. The rooms were cold, the meals were sparse, and laughter was a rare occurrence. She spent her days sitting in the corner of the common room, clutching a tattered teddy bear, her only connection to the parents she had lost. The caretakers had told her, gently but firmly, that her parents were dead. It was a story she had heard often from the older children. Accidents, illnesses, and tragedies that left them here, waiting for someone to take them away. But Ella was too young to fully understand what it meant to be an orphan. All she knew was that her mother's soft lullabies and her father's warm hugs were gone, leaving behind an ache that never quite went away. "Ella!" a kind voice called out, breaking her from her thoughts. She turned to see Miss Grace, one of the kinder caretakers, standing by the door. Beside her were two strangers, a man and a woman. They looked out of place in the orphanage, their clean, pressed clothes and warm smiles starkly different from the tired faces Ella was used to seeing. "Ella, come here, sweetheart," Miss Grace said, beckoning her closer. Hesitantly, Ella rose from her spot, clutching her bear tightly as she shuffled toward them. The woman crouched down to her level, her eyes kind and her smile gentle. "Hello, Ella," the woman said softly. "My name is Margaret, and this is my husband, Robert. We've heard so much about you." Ella blinked, unsure what to say. She looked at the man, who gave her a reassuring nod. Margaret continued, her voice warm and soothing. "We were wondering if you'd like to come home with us." "Home?" "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said. "A place where you'll have your own room, warm meals, and a family." Ella glanced at Miss Grace, who smiled and gave her a small nod. Slowly, she turned back to Margaret and whispered, "Okay." The ride to the garrison home was quiet. Ella sat in the back seat of the car, her teddy bear clutched to her chest as she stared out the window. She didn't know what to expect, but a flicker of hope began to stir in her chest. Maybe this would be different. When they arrived, Ella's eyes widened. The house wasn't large, but it looked cozy, with flower boxes under the windows and a small porch swing. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, and she could hear the faint hum of voices inside. "This is your new home," Robert said, opening the car door for her. Ella stepped out, her small shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. Margaret took her hand, leading her inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her, and for a moment, she felt like she could breathe again. The voices she had heard belonged to 4 boys, who were now standing in the living room, watching her curiously. They ranged in age from 6 to 14, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "This is Ella," Margaret said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "She's going to be staying with us." The boys muttered their hellos, though their interest quickly waned. Ella felt their stares linger for a moment longer than necessary, making her shift uncomfortably. "Why don't you boys show her around?" Robert suggested. The oldest boy, Tom, shrugged. "Sure." They led Ella through the house, pointing out the kitchen, the small bathroom, and the room she would share with Margaret's sewing supplies. It was tiny but clean, with a bed neatly made up with a pink quilt. Ella ran her fingers over the fabric, marveling at how soft it felt compared to the scratchy blankets at the orphanage. As the boys returned to their own activities, Ella stood in her new room, taking it all in. She wasn't sure what to think yet, but a part of her dared to hope that this might be the start of something better. It didn't take long for Ella to learn her place in the garrison household. Margaret and Robert were kind, but their kindness had limits. Ella was expected to help around the house and in the bakery, a bustling little shop attached to their home. She learned to knead dough, mix batters, and sweep the floors before she even started school. The boys treated her differently. Tom, the eldest, barely acknowledged her, while the second and third sons, Nate and Ben, were quick to remind her that she wasn't their sister. They teased her about her small stature and her quiet nature, often leaving her feeling more alone than ever. Only Liam, the 4th son, treated her kindly. At 7 years older than Ella, He had a calm, gentle way about him that set him apart from his brothers. He would help her with her chores, sneak her treats from the bakery, and sit with her when she looked lonely. One day, as Ella was cleaning the flour-covered counter in the bakery, Liam walked in and handed her a cookie. "You should take a break," he said with a grin. Ella looked at the cookie and then at him, hesitant. "I'm not supposed to eat the cookies." Liam shrugged. "What they don't know won't hurt them." She took the cookie, her fingers brushing his, and smiled. "Thank you, Liam." "Anytime, kiddo," he said, ruffling her hair. For the first time since she had arrived, Ella felt a small spark of happiness. Maybe she wasn't completely alone after all. Ella's new life settled into a rhythm that felt both comforting and tiring. Each morning, she woke before the sun rose, tying her apron and stepping into the warm, flour-dusted air of the bakery. The smell of bread baking filled the space, blending with the sound of Margaret humming softly as she worked. It was peaceful, yet Ella always sensed that her role was different from the rest of the family. At school, Ella kept to herself. She didn't have time for friends, and she was always aware that she wasn't like the other kids. Most of her classmates had parents who came to school events or picked them up after the bell. Ella walked home alone, her books tucked under one arm as she hurried back to the bakery. In the evenings, she would clean trays and wipe down counters, her hands often aching by the time she was finished. The work was hard, but it kept her mind busy. Sometimes, when she looked at Margaret's tired face or Robert's firm instructions, she wondered if this was all life had to offer her. The boys were a world apart from Ella. As they grew older, they became more independent, their energy filling the house with noise and laughter. Tom, the eldest, was often too busy with his own plans to pay Ella much attention. Nate and Ben, the second and third sons, sometimes teased her in ways that felt a little mean-spirited. "Hey, Ella, why don't you bake us some cookies?" Nate joked one evening, smirking. "She probably eats half of them before they make it to the tray," Ben added, laughing. Ella flushed, keeping her head down as she scrubbed the table. Liam, however, was different. He was quieter than his brothers, with a calm and thoughtful way about him. He noticed things that others didn't, like the way Ella's shoulders slumped after a long day, or how her hands trembled when she was nervous. "Leave her alone," Liam would say, his voice steady but firm. The teasing would stop, but Ella never forgot the sting of their words. She couldn't blame them entirely. After all, she wasn't really their sister. She was just Ella. By the time she turned 14, most of the boys had left the house. Tom joined the military, Nate went off to study, and Ben found a job in the city. The house became quieter, and with each son that left, Ella felt the emptiness grow. Liam stayed the longest, leaving when he was 20. On the day he said goodbye, he found Ella sitting on the porch, her hands folded in her lap. "I'm going to miss you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled and sat beside her. "I'll miss you too, kiddo, but I'll be back to visit." Ella nodded, her heart heavy. She wanted to tell him how much his kindness had meant to her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched as he walked away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared from view. With the boys gone, Ella's world shrank even more. Margaret and Robert kept her busy, and though they provided for her, their interactions were always centered on work. At night, she would sit by the window in her small room, looking out at the stars. Sometimes she imagined her parents were watching her, their love shining down like the faint light of the moon. "Maybe one day," she whispered to herself, clutching her old teddy bear, "maybe things will change." Ella was 21 when Liam returned. By then, her life had settled into a predictable routine: school, the bakery, and the quiet evenings in her small room. The once busy house felt hollow now, with just Margaret and Robert for company. Though they were kind in their way, Ella often felt like an outsider in their world. It was a rainy afternoon when she heard the sound of a car pulling up to the house. Ella glanced out the window and saw a sleek black car parked in the driveway. The door opened and out stepped Liam, holding a briefcase in one hand and shaking raindrops from his coat with the other. Her heart skipped. It had been years since she'd seen him, but she recognized him instantly. He was taller, broader, and his features were sharper now, but his warm, familiar smile hadn't changed. The door swung open, and Ella, wiping her hands on her apron, stepped out from the bakery's back room. Liam spotted her immediately. "Ella!" he said, his voice filled with delight. "Liam?" she replied, almost unsure if it was really him. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he strode toward her and pulled her into a hug. Ella stiffened at first, but his warmth melted her hesitation, and she found herself hugging him back. "You've grown up," he said, stepping back to look at her. "So have you," she said softly, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He laughed. "Fair enough. But wow, it's good to see you. I've missed this place. And you." She blinked, caught off guard. "You missed me?" "Of course," he said, as if it were obvious. "You were the best part of this house." Liam's arrival brought a burst of energy back into the house. He'd recently completed a big project in the city and had taken on a new one close to the family home. He decided to stay for a while, claiming it was a perfect excuse to spend time with his parents and reconnect with Ella. For Ella, his presence was a breath of fresh air. He wasn't like his brothers, who had either teased her or treated her as invisible. Liam genuinely cared, and it showed in the little things he did. He noticed her struggles, like the way her hands trembled after a long day in the bakery, or how she seemed hesitant to speak her mind. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Liam turned to her with a thoughtful look. "Do you ever go anywhere, Ella?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not really. Between school and the bakery, there's no time. And even if there was, I wouldn't know where to go." He frowned. "That's not right. You're young. You should be out there, experiencing life, not just stuck here." "It's fine," she said, shrugging. "This is my life." Liam leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Well, it shouldn't be. Tomorrow we're going out. No excuses." Ella's eyes widened. "What? I can't just leave. Margaret and Robert." "They'll understand," he interrupted. "And if they don't, I'll handle it. You deserve more than this, Ella." True to his word, Liam showed up the next morning, his car keys jingling in his hand. Ella hesitated at the door, her hands nervously smoothing the simple blue dress she had picked out. She hadn't dressed up in years, and it felt strange to wear something other than her bakery uniform. "You look great," Liam said with an easy smile, opening the passenger door for her. "Thanks," she murmured, feeling her cheeks heat. The drive into town was quiet at first, but Liam soon had her laughing with stories about his time in the city. They stopped at a local cafe for coffee, and Liam insisted on ordering for her, claiming he knew the best things on the menu. As they walked through the streets, Ella felt like she was seeing the world for the first time. Liam bought her a bouquet of wildflowers from a street vendor, grinning as he handed it to her. "These suit you," he said. She smiled, holding the flowers close. "Thank you." At a small park, Liam urged her to try the swings. "Come on, Ella," he said, his tone teasing. "You can't tell me you've forgotten how to have fun." She hesitated, but his enthusiasm was infectious. Soon she was laughing as the swing carried her higher and higher, the wind tugging at her hair. When they returned home, Ella's heart was lighter than it had been in years. But Margaret was waiting for them, her arms crossed and her expression stern. "Where have you been?" she demanded. Liam's tone was calm but firm. "I took Ella out. She needed a break. She has responsibilities here," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "This isn't the time for outings." "With all due respect," Liam replied, "she's been working nonstop for years. She deserves a little time for herself." Margaret didn't respond, but the tension was thick in the room. Ella felt her chest tighten, unsure of what to say or do. Later that night, as she lay in bed clutching the wildflowers Liam had given her, she felt something stir inside her, a small spark of hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the bakery. Months passed, and Liam's presence became a constant in Ella's life. He brought warmth and light into her world, and their bond deepened in ways neither of them could have predicted. They spent evenings talking on the porch, sharing stories and dreams. Liam encouraged her to think about her future and what she wanted beyond the walls of the bakery. But not everyone was happy with the growing closeness between them. Margaret, in particular, seemed uneasy. She would cast sharp looks in their direction whenever she caught them laughing or sitting too close. Robert, while less vocal, often cleared his throat loudly when Liam and Ella lingered too long in the same room. It wasn't long before Margaret decided to address the issue directly. One evening, after dinner, Margaret called Ella into the kitchen under the pretense of helping with the dishes. As soon as the door closed, her tone shifted. "Ella," Margaret began, her voice low but firm, "I've noticed you and Liam spending a lot of time together." Ella paused, her hands still damp from washing a plate. "Yes, he's been very kind to me. He's like a brother." Margaret cut her off sharply. "He is not your brother, and that's exactly the problem." Confusion flashed across Ella's face. "I don't understand," Margaret sighed, wiping her hands on a towel. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever you think is happening between you two, it cannot happen. Liam is part of this family, and you are not." The words stung, but Ella forced herself to meet Margaret's gaze. "I've never thought of him that way," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Good," Margaret replied, her tone softening slightly. "Because if you did, it would only lead to trouble. Do you understand?" Ella nodded, though her chest felt heavy. She knew Margaret's warning came from a place of authority, but it also felt like a wall being built around her dreams. Despite Margaret's warning, Liam's behavior didn't change. He continued to treat Ella with the same kindness and affection, and over time, those feelings blossomed into something more. Ella tried to push them down, remembering Margaret's words, but it was impossible to ignore the way her heart raced whenever Liam smiled at her or brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. One day, Liam found her in the garden, tending to the small patch of flowers she had planted years ago. "Hey," he said, crouching down beside her. "I've been looking for you." Ella glanced up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said with a grin. "I just wanted to see you." Her heart skipped a beat, but she tried to keep her tone light. "You see me all the time, Liam." "Not enough," he said, his voice quieter now. "Ella, can I ask you something?" She hesitated, unsure of where this was going. "Of course. Do you ever think about leaving this place? Starting fresh somewhere else?" Ella's hands stilled in the soil. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it's not that simple. This is the only life I've ever known. What if I told you I want more for you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Liam," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I know what Margaret and Robert think, but I don't care. You're not just someone who works here, Ella. You're everything to me. And I want to be everything to you, too." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she shook her head. "They'll never allow it. Margaret already told me. I don't care what they say," Liam interrupted. "If it's not you, Ella, then I don't want anyone else. I'll fight for us, no matter what it takes." When Liam told his parents about his feelings for Ella, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Margaret was furious, pacing the living room as she gestured wildly. "This is unacceptable, Liam," she shouted. "She's like a daughter to us. You can't possibly think this is right." "She's not your daughter," Liam shot back, his voice rising. "You've treated her like an outsider her whole life, and now you want to act like she's family? It's hypocrisy, and you know it." Margaret's face reddened, but before she could respond, Robert stepped in. "Enough," he said firmly. "This isn't about hypocrisy. It's about what's proper. And this isn't." Liam's jaw tightened. "Proper? Do you even care about what Ella feels? About what I feel?" Margaret turned to Ella, her eyes cold. "You won't marry my son. Do you hear me? If you do, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." Ella's voice trembled as she spoke. "I never wanted to cause trouble. You'll stay away from him," Margaret said, cutting her off. "That's final." On the day of the wedding, Ella's heart was heavy. She was supposed to be marrying Liam, but Margaret had made her threats clear. Hours before the ceremony, Margaret cornered her in her room, her voice dripping with venom. "You won't walk down that aisle," Margaret said. "If you do, I'll make sure you disappear. Do you understand me?" Tears streamed down Ella's face as she nodded. She couldn't risk it, not for herself, and not for Liam. As the ceremony began, Liam stood at the altar, his eyes scanning the crowd for Ella. When the bride finally walked down the aisle, he smiled, but something felt off. She moved stiffly, her face obscured by the veil. When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," Liam lifted the veil and froze. It wasn't Ella. It was someone else entirely. Shock and confusion rippled through the room as Liam stepped back. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the silent church. Margaret's face was pale, but she said nothing. The guests whispered among themselves, but no one had an answer. Liam's heart pounded as he turned to the crowd. "Where is Ella?"